Hello, thank you for joining me in my study. We've been thinking about the objection that God's punishing Christ in our place is incompatible with the demands of retributive justice, and therefore would be unjust on God's part. Last time I argued that this objection does not take significant cognizance of the distinction drawn by legal theorists between justification of the practice of punishment in general and justification of a particular act of punishment. And we saw that legal scholars recognize that even if retributive justice warrants the general practice of punishment, nevertheless, in a specific case, the demands of retributive justice can be justly waived. And so in the case of Christ, it may well be the case that God waives the demands of negative retributive justice in order to punish Christ for our sins. Today, however, I want to draw an additional point against this objection. Namely, the objection is based upon a false assumption. It is based upon the assumption that Christ was innocent, and that therefore it would be unjust for God to punish him for our sins. But on the traditional Reformation doctrine of penal substitution, there is absolutely no question of Christ's being innocent. Rather, in virtue of our sins being imputed to Christ, Christ is legally guilty before God and therefore liable to punishment. And therefore the demands of negative retributive justice do not in any way need to be waived. When we talked about the coherence of the definition of punishment, we saw that the imputation of our sins to Christ could be accomplished in either of two ways. One would be through the use of a legal fiction. God, as the supreme judge, could adopt the legal fiction that Christ actually did the sins for which we deserve punishment. Or alternatively, God could use vicarious liability in imputing the guilt of our wrongdoing to Christ. In either case, as I say, it is not a matter of God's punishing an innocent person for our sins. Rather, in virtue of the imputation of our sin and guilt to Christ, Christ is legally guilty and therefore liable to punishment. So, in summary, I think we've seen that this objection to the justice of penal substitution really doesn't get off the ground. We saw first and foremost that it must be contextualized within a broader theory of right and wrong, and that if one adopts a divine command theory of ethics, then there can simply be no question of accusing God of injustice, since whatever God chooses to do is just. Secondly, I argued that the demands of retributive justice or positive justice, even if essential to God's nature, could be met in God's being a positive retributivist, that is to say, he will always punish the guilty, but only qualifiedly a negative retributivist, in that he reserves for himself the right to punish a divine person, namely Christ himself, for our sins, should he so will. Then thirdly, we saw that the objection doesn't discriminate sufficiently between the justification of the practice of punishment and justification of a particular act of punishment. And finally, we saw that the objection is based upon a false assumption, namely that Christ is innocent, whereas in light of the doctrine of the imputation of sins, Christ is legally liable to punishment, and therefore there is no injustice on God's part. This brings us then to the end of our discussion of both the coherence of the definition of punishment and of the justification of punishment. And we've seen that in neither case is there a substantive objection to the biblical doctrine of penal substitution. But that doesn't end the debate. Next time, I want to take up the question of the satisfaction of God's justice. How is it that God's punishing Christ for our sins satisfies the demands of God's justice? That will be the question that we will open the next time we're together.